There are some things you come to rely on without ever really thinking about them. Like the way a creek sounds in the early morning, how its water catches the gold of sunrise as it twists between stones. For over 20 years, that creek had been part of my life. It curved along the edge of my backyard like an old friend. I planted apple trees near it when my daughter was still in diapers, and every spring she'd float leaves down the current like tiny boats. I thought I knew every inch of that stream bed. But nothing prepared me for the sight I came home to that morning in early May. I'd just returned from a short trip to visit my brother in Flagstaff. 3 days. That's all I was gone. And when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something wrong before I even cut the engine. The air felt sterile. Still. The sound of the creek, always a soft murmur, was gone. I walked to the backyard with my bags still in hand, and there it was, a chain-link fence 7 feet tall, with bright orange, no trespassing signs zip-tied every 6 feet. It didn't just run along the perimeter. It cut through my property, severing the creek from my garden and slicing straight across my land like a surgical scar. For a long moment, I just stood there blinking, thinking maybe I was hallucinating from the heat. Then I noticed the cameras, mounted right onto the posts angled at my side of the yard. Not only had someone installed a fence, they were watching me too. I set the bags down and crossed to where the fence cut across a patch of gravel. A laminated sign fluttered in the breeze. HOA Environmental Rehabilitation Zone. Trespassers will be reported to authorities. HOA Environmental Rehabilitation. I could feel my pulse tighten behind my eyes. I hadn't received any notice, any email, any vote. I'd paid my dues. I showed up to the boring meetings. I followed the petty landscaping guidelines. But now they were claiming jurisdiction over a piece of land that had always been mine. I stormed back into the house, grabbed the folder where I kept my property deed, and flipped through the paperwork. There it was, plain as daylight, the creek and the entire riparian area surrounding it within my parcel boundaries. I had photos, old ones, new ones. I even had a map from the county assessor's office that clearly outlined the natural boundary lines. I wasn't confused. They were wrong. But that didn't stop the sick feeling pooling in my stomach. That night, I emailed the HOA. I kept it formal, respectful, but firm. I attached copies of my deed, GPS survey screenshots, and asked for clarification about who had authorized the fence. I sent it to 3 addresses: General Board Legal Inquiries and the president herself. By morning, I had a reply, a 1-line email from someone named KM at the HOA enforcement team. Due to ongoing environmental protection measures, access to shared water resources may be temporarily restricted. Thank you for your cooperation. Shared water resources. That was the phrase that lit the fuse. The next day, I drove to the HOA office in person. It was tucked into a 2-story beige building next to a dentist's office and a Pilates studio. Everything about it screamed bland bureaucracy. But when I walked in and asked to speak to whoever had authorized the fence, the receptionist just smiled and said someone would follow up soon. That someone showed up in my backyard 2 days later, wearing black tactical pants, a utility vest with patches that read HOA Patrol, and a baseball cap stitched with Neighborhood Compliance Officer. And there she was, Karen, the woman every neighborhood seems to birth like a virus in human form. Platinum blonde bob wraparound sunglasses, clipboard clenched like a weapon. She looked like she'd studied mall cop documentaries for inspiration. "You're trespassing," she said before I could open my mouth. "On my land," I asked, stepping toward her. She held up a laminated badge on a lanyard that looked like something made at a carnival booth. "This area is under the oversight of the Creekside Watershed Environmental Plan," she said in a tone that sounded rehearsed. "It's currently off limits per Article 12, Section G of the HOA Charter. I need you to step back." I squinted at her. "You're not law enforcement." "I'm HOA enforcement," she said, puffing her chest slightly. "This is a sensitive conservation area. You're interfering with an active rehabilitation zone." I stared at her in disbelief. "The only thing this creek needs rehabilitation from is you." She smiled coldly and said, "Sir, continued noncompliance will be documented and referred to the proper municipal agencies." I walked away before I said something I'd regret. But I took a long, hard look at that fence, at the cameras, at Karen's self-important swagger. This wasn't going to stop on its own. Something told me this was only the beginning. And I was right. I'd seen people drunk on power before. During my time in the service, I watched lieutenants implode under the weight of their own ego barking orders just to hear themselves speak. But nothing prepared me for the surreal theater of HOA Karen marching around in tactical boots, acting like a one-woman police force in our sleepy cul-de-sac. It started just 2 days after our first confrontation at the fence. I tried to remain calm, figuring that maybe, just maybe, she'd overstepped and the board would walk things back once I'd presented the right paperwork. I was wrong. That morning, I went out to trim the overgrown branches near the creek. I'd spent half the night revisiting county water maps, confirming that the stream's flow hadn't changed course in decades, and that its path cut squarely across my lot. The legal language was dry, but I knew what it meant that creek belonged to me, not the HOA. I stepped into the backyard with a pair of loppers slung over my shoulder, and before I could even start, a voice rang out behind me. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the restricted area." I turned. Karen stood behind the fence, in full mock regalia, navy cargo pants, a bright yellow reflective vest, with HOA compliance unit stenciled on the back, a fake body cam strapped to her chest, and unbelievably a holstered radio clipped to her belt like a badge. "Are you serious right now?" I asked, my voice flat. She held up a plastic ID dangling from her lanyard. "This area is under investigation," she said. "I've been authorized to secure the perimeter per HOA Enforcement Code 417. "There is no such code," I said, not bothering to hide my disbelief. "And you're not law enforcement." "I'm a neighborhood officer with delegated authority," she said. "Your actions are being recorded." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Delegated by who?" "Chuck and the landscaping committee." Her jaw tightened. "You're trespassing," she repeated, her voice rising. I walked toward her, slowly stopping a few feet from the fence. "You're the one issuing threats on my property. That camera," I pointed to the blinking light atop one of the fence posts, "is pointed directly at my home. You realize that's a violation of California Civil Code, right?" That seemed to throw her, but only for a second. "I suggest you lawyer up if you're going to keep interfering with an environmental restoration project," she barked. I took out my phone. "Great idea," I said, snapping a photo of her. "In fact, I've already contacted a lawyer, and the county, and the water authority. So, unless you're carrying a real badge, I'd suggest you stop interfering." Karen's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "You're digging your own grave, sir." I wanted to scream. Instead, I went back inside. That kind of smug certainty, the kind that comes from people convinced they're untouchable, it made my skin crawl. I thought about my daughter Ellie, now grown and off at university, who used to chase frogs in that creek, barefoot in the summer. I thought about the oak tree I planted there the year my wife passed the roots stretching close to the stream like they knew where the strength was. I wasn't just fighting for land. I was fighting for memory. Over the next week, Karen intensified her act. Every morning, she'd patrol the fence line like she was guarding a federal prison. She started wearing a body camera strapped with electrical tape like some warped cosplay of a deputy. She'd strut back and forth with a clipboard barking into her walkie-talkie, sometimes calling in reports that were clearly just rehearsals for some HOA meeting where she'd puff herself up. Then came the real escalation. On Thursday, I caught her inside the fence line, on my side, snapping photos of my garden hose, which ran from the back faucet toward a row of newly planted tomatoes. When I confronted her, she actually barked. "Step back. You're interfering with a compliance investigation." I stood there in disbelief. "This isn't an investigation. This is harassment. You're in violation of HOA Regulation B12, she said, flipping her clipboard toward me. "Unapproved irrigation near a protected stream." I didn't respond. I turned, walked inside, and called my lawyer. That night, I spoke with a contact at the county water board. I told him what was happening, and he was incredulous. "HOAs don't have jurisdiction over natural waterways," he said, "especially not if the water runs through your private lot. That's a property rights issue, not an HOA governance one." I asked about the so-called Watershed plan Karen kept referencing. "That would need to be filed publicly," he replied. "And it would need to be approved by multiple departments," which, to my knowledge, it hasn't. That was the confirmation I needed. They were bluffing. The next morning, I stood at the fence and waited. Sure enough, Karen appeared at 7:00 a.m. sharp, her utility vest freshly ironed, body cam blinking red, and clipboard in hand. "Morning, Officer Karen," I called out. Her head snapped toward me. "I just got off the phone with the water board," I said. They're not aware of any approved watershed restoration plan, nor did they authorize a fence. You're committing trespass and impersonating a peace officer. I'd think twice before stepping onto my property again. Her face flushed, but she said nothing. I also filed a formal complaint with the county. I added, "You can expect a call soon." She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. Her eyes darted toward the camera on the post like it might back her up. Then she turned and stormed off. But something in her posture told me this wasn't over. It was a temporary retreat, not a surrender. And that meant I had to be ready for whatever came next. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with the ceiling fan turning lazily above me, its blades slicing the air, like the days had been slicing through my patience. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that chain link fence, saw Karen's smug expression behind those mirrored sunglasses, and felt that deep ache in my chest, the kind that doesn't come from fear, but from something more bitter. Invasion. There's a particular pain that comes when the land you've worked, walked, and loved is treated like someone else's playground. My late wife Rachel used to say that a man doesn't really own land, he stewards it, takes care of it, lives in harmony with it, and I had. For 21 years, that creek ran like a quiet heartbeat through my life, and now it had been severed by a self-appointed tyrant with a clipboard. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about control, about a neighbor who had gotten so drunk on her own delusion of authority that she'd built a fantasy police force in her head, and worse, convinced a few others to play along. I sat up, swung my feet onto the cold hardwood, and decided that was it. I wasn't going to wait around for someone to give me permission to fight back. I was going to dismantle this nonsense one layer at a time, and I was going to start with the law. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. It was an old building tucked behind the courthouse with buzzing fluorescent lights and the constant smell of stale coffee. I knew my way around the place. Back in my younger days, I'd worked as a civilian consultant with the Army Corps of Engineers, focusing on watershed mapping and land use boundaries. That job had introduced me to all kinds of bureaucratic rabbit holes, and I was about to dive into one again. I requested everything related to my parcel, the plat maps, the historical surveys. I asked for the most recent filings from the HOA too, anything mentioning creekside watershed, rehabilitation, or protected restoration zones. The clerk, a woman named Judy with reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, frowned as she scrolled through her terminal. "Only thing I've got here is a generic easement request from 2017, she said, filed by the HOA, but it was denied. Something about floodplain conflict. Nothing since." She shook her head. "If they're claiming authority over a watershed, they'd need to file a public notice and get state environmental board approval. That'd take months, probably years." That made me pause. They hadn't just overstepped. They had fabricated authority. I spent the rest of the afternoon scanning documents and sending them to a lawyer named Jordan Blake. He specialized in HOA abuse and had a reputation for being aggressive when the lines of power got blurry. "I love cases like this," he said during our first call. "HOAs think they're above the law until someone reads the fine print." He asked me to send pictures of the fence, the signs, Karen's fake uniform, and copies of any correspondence I had. I gave him everything. The emails, the timestamps, even screenshots of her radioing into no one with her little toy walkie-talkie. By the end of the day, I had a plan. Jordan would draft a cease and desist letter citing harassment, trespassing, illegal surveillance, and impersonation. We'd also request removal of the fence within 10 business days or face an injunction. But I wasn't done. I drove home and pulled out a drone I used for checking tree health on the far side of the property. It had a decent camera, 4K with zoom, and I flew it over the fence line. Sure enough, the HOA had laid down gravel paths on my land, even installed a small irrigation pipe running water out of the creek. They weren't just fencing it off. They were diverting it. That was a felony. And suddenly something Karen had said echoed in my head. This is a sensitive conservation area. What if this wasn't just Karen's fantasy? What if there was a broader plan in motion, one the rest of the board either supported or were too intimidated to question? That night, I dug deeper. I opened the HOA's online portal. Most homeowners ignored it, just a place to pay dues or download the occasional newsletter. But I knew better. HOA boards often posted meeting minutes buried in submenus, hoping no one ever bothered to read them. And there it was. January 14th, special session. Motion introduced to initiate preliminary planning for the Creekside Nature Corridor, including pedestrian access, irrigation installation, and funding request via general assessment increase. Pending legal approval. My name wasn't listed anywhere. My lot wasn't marked on the rough map scanned into the PDF. But the path they drew, it went right through my creek. They were trying to develop a public nature walk on private land they didn't own using HOA funds with plans to increase dues to pay for it. No one had voted. No letters had gone out. No public notice. It was a land grab hidden under the guise of conservation. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I felt that old military instinct surge in my gut, not anger, not fear, but focus. They'd chosen the wrong man to push. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to bury this entire scheme. And for that, I needed something bigger than cease and desist letters. I needed leverage. That's when I remembered something from the core days about how watershed control wasn't just legal territory. It was hydrological. Whoever controlled the source controlled everything downstream. And the upstream parcels, a few of them had been abandoned for years. They were part of an old bankruptcy case from the 2008 housing crash. Land nobody wanted, land with water rights. If they were still in limbo and I could find the trustee, I could buy the headwaters, control the flow, and make their entire plan collapse before it even reached the riverbank. It was time to go upstream literally and figuratively. And once I did, they'd never see it coming. I spent the next 2 days chasing the map upstream, both literally and legally. My boots were soaked, my jeans caked with mud, and my laptop screen full of property records and court filings from a decade ago. But I didn't care. I was moving with purpose now. A man with a mission doesn't feel fatigue, not when he's fighting for something bigger than just land. He feels momentum. The parcels above mine had once belonged to a failed housing development. Back in 2007, a company called Silverbank Holdings had planned to build 30 luxury cabins along the Upper Creek Ridge. But the recession hit and the entire project collapsed before a single nail was driven. The land had sat vacant ever since, slowly reverting to wild grass and brush, the creek winding undisturbed through it. It took a few late-night calls and a favor from an old friend who still worked in county land acquisitions. But I finally got the name I was looking for, Marcia Klein, a bankruptcy trustee in Santa Clara County. She managed the remaining assets from Silverbank's liquidation, including the upstream watershed lots. The moment I had her on the phone, I knew I had a shot. "You're the first person to ask about those parcels in years," she said, flipping through her files. "They're environmentally sensitive, zoned non-developable. But technically, they're still available for private sale. Just need to go through the proper bid process." "And do they include riparian rights?" I asked. She paused. "According to the deed history, yes, including upstream water control since the parcels border the spring head." I nearly dropped the phone. The headwaters. If I owned those parcels, I would control the origin of the creek that ran through my land and every inch of it before it reached the HOA's jurisdiction. It meant I could legally decide how much water flowed, who accessed it, and whether any modifications downstream would affect the ecological balance, which meant their entire conservation project, their Creekside Nature Corridor, and their faux police fencing, it would all crumble if I said no. I asked her to send the documents. I filed a purchase request that same afternoon. 3 days later, I held the deed in my hand. And just like that, the power shifted. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I kept it quiet, let the days pass like normal. Karen still made her rounds every morning, walking the perimeter in that ridiculous vest, still radioing into the ether. The HOA newsletter that week included a blurb about progress on the Nature Corridor project and thanked the board members for their vision in restoring our community's natural beauty. It was all so smug, so self-congratulatory. I could practically hear Karen's voice dripping from the text. But behind the scenes, I was gathering more than documents. I was gathering proof. I requested public records of the HOA's permits. Nothing. I filed an environmental impact report request with the county. There was no record of one submitted. I even spoke to the Parks Department director, who laughed out loud when I asked whether he'd signed off on any collaboration. "That group thinks they're the National Park Service," he said. "We haven't approved a single trail or grant for that neighborhood." And yet the HOA had collected thousands in dues for environmental development, citing future tax benefits and community enrichment. That's when I realized this wasn't just a power play. This was fraud. I compiled everything into a folder on my desktop labeled HOA Overreach 2025. Emails, screenshots, maps, drone footage of unauthorized construction, Karen's fence installation timelines, and most importantly, the deed to the headwaters. Then I paid a visit to Jordan, my lawyer, and laid it all out on his conference table. His eyes lit up like a man looking at buried treasure. "You realize what this is?" he asked, holding up the deed. "This isn't just leverage. This is a hammer. You could stop everything." I nodded. "That's the idea." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Let's make them swing first. Let them come at you with one more move. Then we strike." He was right. And right on cue they came. 3 days later, I received a formal violation notice taped to my front door. The HOA accused me of unauthorized water diversion, unapproved excavation within conservation easements, and refusal to cooperate with HOA patrol. It was laughable. None of it had legal backing. But they copied the city zoning department, the county environmental board, and even the local sheriff's office. They were trying to bluff me with bureaucracy. But they didn't realize I'd already checked with every agency. No one backed them. No one had given them the green light. They were a paper tiger roaring into the wind. That same day, a neighbor named Derek stopped me by the mailbox. Middle-aged guy, friendly, used to coach Little League. "Hey," he said, eyes shifty. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What's going on with the creek Karen's telling people you're building a dam or rerouting the water to flood the clubhouse or something? Says you're acting like you own the whole watershed." I smiled. "That's because I do." He blinked. "You what?" "I bought the upstream parcels last week. Legally. Through the trustee of the old Silverbank Holdings bankruptcy case. Includes full riparian rights." Derek just stared. "So no," I continued. "I'm not building a dam, but I could." He let out a low whistle. Holy hell. I could see it in his eyes, the gears turning. The realization that maybe, just maybe, Karen wasn't the omnipotent enforcer she pretended to be. That evening, I walked the length of the creek behind my home. The sun hung low over the pines, casting long shadows across the water. The fence was still there, a monument to pettiness. But I no longer felt powerless when I looked at it. The current still flowed, and now I controlled its source. What they didn't know yet was that they had been building their castle on a stream bed I now owned, and I was about to let the truth wash it all away. I don't know what I expected them to do. Once they found out I wasn't bluffing. Apologize, back off, maybe have the decency to admit they'd overstepped. Of course not. Karen did what Karen always does. When cornered, she doubled down. The first clue came the next morning when I heard the familiar sound of her boots crunching on gravel behind the fence. I was sitting on the back deck with a cup of coffee, watching the sun peek through the trees when I caught sight of her pacing. But this time she wasn't alone. 2 men were with her. One tall broad, wearing aviator sunglasses, and the other short and stocky with a clipboard. Neither of them wore any kind of official uniform, just matching polo shirts with Neighborhood Compliance Task Force embroidered on the breast. They moved like they had authority. That was the part that bothered me. Karen pointed at the creek, waving dramatically. The stocky one jotted something down. Then she turned and motioned toward my house. All 3 of them looked directly at me. I stood slow and deliberate and lifted my phone. That was enough to make them move on. I followed their path from the porch, watching them cross the neighboring lot and vanish behind the fence line. It was subtle, but I could feel that something had shifted, and I wasn't wrong. That afternoon, I received a second notice, hand-delivered this time by one of the so-called task force members. It accused me of unauthorized disturbance of a sensitive ecological corridor, non-compliance with HOA restoration standards, and most ridiculously verbal aggression towards safety personnel. I laughed when I read that last part. Verbal aggression. I hadn't said a single word to those goons. But it didn't stop there. They began canvassing the neighborhood. I found out from Derek, and later from Mrs. Ramirez down the street, that Karen had been going door to door warning neighbors about my suspicious activity and accusing me of trying to sabotage the HOA's creek revitalization project. She said you threatened her, Mrs. Ramirez told me, concerned. Said you had a temper, that you've been stockpiling chemicals near the waterline. What chemicals? I asked, incredulous. She shrugged. I didn't believe her, but a few folks seemed to. And that was the moment it clicked. Karen wasn't trying to win a legal battle anymore. She was trying to win a narrative. If she couldn't beat me with rules, she'd smear me into silence. Paint me as dangerous, unhinged, a threat to the community. And maybe, just maybe, she was hoping I'd lash out, give her exactly the kind of outburst she needed to escalate things further. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I went quiet. I stopped answering her notices. I stopped showing up to HOA meetings. I let them talk. But what I did do was start recording everything. I installed my own cameras, better ones. A full perimeter setup that captured audio and video in high definition. I kept logs of every visit, every so-called inspection, every interaction. I kept them legal, kept them dated and time-stamped. Jordan told me to think like I was building a case, not a fight. And I was. Especially after what happened next. I woke up one morning to the sound of shouting outside. When I got to the backyard, I saw 3 orange-vested compliance officers tearing up a section of ground near the creek on my side of the fence. One of them held a roll of measuring tape. Another was using spray paint to mark the dirt. Karen stood nearby, barking orders. I yelled from the porch, "You're trespassing." She looked up with that same icy smile. "This is an emergency compliance audit," she called back. "We've identified unauthorized modifications to protected land. We're documenting it for code enforcement." "You're on my property," I snapped. "You no longer have exclusive rights to the riparian corridor," she said, parroting some nonsense from the last notice. "It's under joint stewardship per Article 12 of the Charter, which doesn't override state property law," I shot back. I called the sheriff. To my surprise, a deputy actually showed up 20 minutes later. His name was Beck, tall guy, professional. He stepped onto the property with caution notepad in hand. I explained everything, showed him the deed, the footage, the map, even the video of Karen stepping over the fence that very morning. When he finally spoke to her, I watched from the deck. She went from smug to shrill in under a minute. "This man is a threat," she insisted. "He's hostile. He's hoarding water." Deputy Beck gave her a look like she'd just suggested the earth was flat. "I'm going to stop you right there," he said. "None of this is criminal. And unless you can show me a court order giving you legal access to this land, you and your team need to leave. Now." She looked stunned. "Ma'am," he added, "you're lucky he didn't press trespassing charges." Karen didn't respond. She just turned, muttered something to her crew, and stormed off, vest flapping behind her like a cheap cape. But she wasn't finished. That evening, my mailbox was ripped off its post. My garden hose had been slashed, and someone threw a dead possum over the fence and into my compost pile. It was cowardly, childish, but effective. I started sleeping with the windows locked, a security light on, and my phone by the bed. And yet, even through the anxiety, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't fear anymore. It was fire. I'd tried diplomacy. I'd tried logic. Now it was time to prepare for war, not with fists or shouting, but with facts, documents, and truth. The only weapons that matter when fighting people who hide behind fake rules and plastic badges. And with the Watershed deed in my hand, the law on my side, and a growing folder of violations against them, I was ready to bring the whole charade crashing down. Not in anger, but with precision. I didn't tell anyone the moment the sale went through. No dramatic announcement. No press release. Just a quietly notarized deed that gave me ownership of all 5 upstream parcels above the HOA development, along with the watershed rights that came with them. It felt almost anticlimactic, standing there in the county clerk's office, watching the woman behind the plexiglass stamp my paperwork like it was just another Tuesday. But I knew what it meant. I now controlled the source of the water that ran through this neighborhood, and Karen had no idea. The moment I walked out of that office, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. Peace. The kind of peace that only comes from knowing the chessboard had shifted and that I was now several moves ahead. But this was no time to gloat. The beauty of leverage is in how you use it and when. I took the next week to lay the groundwork. First, I had a full hydrological survey conducted on my new parcels. I hired a pair of graduate students from the local university smart kids who lit up when I said the word riparian study. They mapped the watershed's flow-tested soil quality and measured discharge rates at multiple points along the creek. Their data confirmed what I already suspected. Every gallon of water that ran through the HOA's so-called environmental corridor started with a slow drip on my land. Second, I consulted Jordan to begin drafting a set of water management policies. Nothing aggressive, nothing retaliatory. Just enough to legally define how water would be used, conserved, and monitored across my holdings. He helped me file it with the county as a landowner-issued stewardship declaration. It was a masterstroke, subtle, clean, and enforceable. Anyone attempting to alter the creek's flow now had to notify me in writing and request approval. And third, I hired a surveyor to place discrete but permanent boundary markers stamped steel rods at the corners of each upstream lot, all GPS logged and legally recorded. I didn't post signs. I didn't need to. I wasn't interested in showmanship. I was interested in control. Meanwhile, Karen kept playing pretend. I watched from my porch as she paraded her task force up and down the fence line, still wearing that reflective vest like it was armor. I caught glimpses of their printed maps, still showing the creekside nature corridor, cutting right through the creek bed as if it were theirs to tame. But they weren't building, they weren't digging, just a lot of walking, pointing, and posturing. Because I'd rattled them. Deputy Beck's warning had landed. And with my cameras up, my legal defenses drawn, they were treading more carefully now. That is until the newsletter dropped. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked neatly into every mailbox in the neighborhood. Glossy cover, full-color photos, and on the second page, a letter from the HOA board. We are proud to announce that the Creekside Nature Corridor project is moving forward as planned with the support of our environmental committee and the enthusiastic backing of our community members. It went on to mention expanded trail development, community workshops, and this was the kicker, a partnership with upstream stakeholders to ensure water flow sustainability. I read that line 3 times. Upstream stakeholders. That was me. And no one had contacted me, which meant they were either bluffing or worse, they had no idea who owned the upstream rights now. That was the moment I decided to pull the pin. I called a special community forum. HOA rules allowed any homeowner to reserve time to speak at a meeting with 5 days' notice. I submitted the request, kept it vague. Property rights and watershed update, presented by landowner. Karen didn't even blink. She probably thought I was going to rant again. And that's exactly what I wanted her to think. The meeting was held in the Community Rec Center. It was a beige room with fluorescent lights and stackable chairs, but it filled quickly. The drama had been simmering for weeks now, and everyone knew something was brewing. Karen sat at the front with her arms folded, flanked by 2 board members, and a man I hadn't seen before, probably another compliance officer in disguise. She looked confident, smug even. I waited until they finished their updates, none of which mentioned me, before stepping to the microphone. I brought a single manila folder. No theatrics, just facts. Good evening, I said. My name is Jack Lawson. Many of you know me as the owner of the property at Lot 42. I could see a few people nodding. Others looked curious. I'm here to clarify some confusion surrounding the creek, the recent fencing, and the so-called nature corridor. Karen leaned forward, ready to interrupt. I opened the folder. These, I said, holding up a set of documents, are the deeds to 5 parcels upstream of this neighborhood. As of 3 weeks ago, I am the legal owner of the land where the watershed begins. A murmur spread across the room. Karen's face froze. I've filed a riparian stewardship declaration with the county, which means any modifications to the creek's flow path or structure, any so-called rehabilitation projects, require my written consent. Dead silence. In short, I continued, you can't build a trail. You can't alter the banks. You can't partner with upstream stakeholders because there's only one. And you never asked. I handed a copy of the deed to the secretary. Then I looked directly at Karen. And unless this board can produce environmental permits, land use authorizations, and public notices I've somehow missed, I'd strongly suggest you retract the newsletter. Because as of now, any continued interference with the creek will be considered trespassing and water theft under state law. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. No one applauded. No one cheered. They didn't need to. The truth had weight all its own. I turned, walked out, and didn't look back. The next day, the fence was still there, but the signs were gone. I didn't start with anything flashy, just a backhoe, 2 laborers, and a single red marker flag stuck into the soil beside the creek's north bend. It was a mild Monday morning, the air thick with the scent of pine and distant rain when we broke ground. I'd hired a small local crew to help restore a stretch of the creek bed that had eroded over the years. Nothing dramatic, just stabilization work and a few boulder placements to prevent runoff during the upcoming storm season. Completely within my rights, fully permitted by the county. And yet I knew exactly what would happen next. By 10:15 a.m., the first HOA compliance vehicle arrived. It was a gray golf cart with magnetic decals on the side that read Neighborhood Safety. Karen sat behind the wheel, phone in hand, a laminated binder balanced on her lap. Two others rode beside her clipboard guy and a nervous-looking woman who I assumed was their latest recruit. They parked at the edge of the fence, just 20 feet from where we were working. I was helping the crew lay a retaining net when I heard her voice slicing through the sound of the idling engine. "You're operating heavy equipment on protected land." I turned, slowly brushing dust off my gloves. "Good morning, Karen," I called. "Hope you brought your permits." She climbed out of the cart and marched toward the fence binder, flapping in one hand, phone recording with the other. "This activity violates the Restoration Zone Ordinance," she said. "You failed to notify the HOA of changes affecting community resources." "My land, my permits," I replied, nodding toward the laminated sheet displayed clearly on a stake beside the construction zone. "Filed with the county 2 weeks ago. Would you like to see the hydrology survey too?" Her eyes darted to the permit, then to the small crew who'd stopped what they were doing to watch. She adjusted her sunglasses. "That permit doesn't supersede HOA guidelines," she insisted. I stepped forward. "Actually, it does. Because the HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over this section of creek. That's been confirmed by the county, the state water board, and your favorite deputy, Beck." I heard one of the crewmen chuckle quietly behind me. Karen's face twitched. "You can't just excavate and redirect water flow," she snapped. "It affects downstream integrity. You're putting the entire neighborhood at risk." I paused, then pulled out a small folder I'd tucked into my back pocket that morning, just in case. "These," I said calmly, "are the flow rate assessments from the upstream parcels. The changes we're making will reduce flood risk. And you're welcome to file a formal objection with the Environmental Division. But until then, I suggest you step back before someone reports you for interference." It was a bluff, but a good one. She hesitated, then motioned for her team to retreat. I watched as they climbed back into the golf cart and sputtered off, heading down the trail with their precious binder and bruised egos. But I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. Sure enough, an hour later, a white pickup truck with a city logo pulled up to the entrance of my driveway. A code inspector. This one was legitimate, clipboard badge and all. He introduced himself as Calvin Thomas, Public Works. "Mr. Lawson," he said, extending a hand. "We received a complaint about unpermitted water redirection near a riparian corridor. Do you have documentation?" I smiled and handed over the full packet: permits, soil surveys, engineering sign-offs, and deed copies. I'd anticipated this. I'd built the file like a shield. Calvin flipped through it quietly, nodding occasionally. Then he handed it back. "Looks good," he said. "Who filed the complaint?" I already knew. "The HOA board. A woman named Karen, most likely." He nodded, unsurprised. "We've gotten a few from them lately. Most are exaggerated." He looked at the worksite, then at the creek. "Honestly, this is some of the cleanest restoration I've seen all month. You're doing it right." That moment felt like a win. Not just because the law was on my side, but because someone outside the HOA bubble had said it aloud. And soon others would hear it too. By the end of the week, the erosion fix was complete. We planted a buffer of native shrubs and added a small gravel path for maintenance. No bridges, no benches, no grand spectacle, just stewardship. That was what made Karen lose it. A day after we finished, she filed a cease and desist letter through the HOA lawyer, a man named Richard Cordell, who looked like he hadn't read a full case since 1998. The letter accused me of aggressive environmental manipulation and hostile conduct toward elected community leaders. It also demanded immediate cessation of all creekside activities pending an emergency review by the HOA Environmental Committee. I sent it straight to Jordan. He responded on letterhead with 2 simple pages: my deed rights, my permits, and a polite invitation for the HOA to back off before we pursued legal recourse for harassment. But Karen wasn't done. That Saturday, I heard a loud crunch outside and found one of my new survey markers bent at a 45-degree angle. It had been hit with something heavy. A few hours later, the crew found tire tracks near the upper bend of the creek, deep ones leading to the edge of a fragile embankment we'd just stabilized. Someone had driven a vehicle onto the restoration site. I knew who it was. But I also knew better than to react emotionally. Instead, I added the incident to my logbook, included photos, and submitted it as evidence of intentional property interference to both the sheriff's office and Jordan. The gloves were off now, but I wasn't swinging wild. I was documenting, tightening the net. Karen was scrambling, throwing tantrums in HOA meetings, whispering lies to anyone who'd listen. But the narrative was slipping. Too many neighbors had seen the permits. Too many had read the letter Jordan sent. One by one, they stopped nodding along with her. Stopped opening the door when she came knocking. I wasn't just restoring a creek. I was reclaiming my name and the power she'd held over this neighborhood for so long. It was slipping downstream faster than she could stop it. It was late October when I decided the gloves had to come off. The creek was calm that morning, running clean after a light rain, glinting in the cold sun like polished glass. Everything looked peaceful. But underneath, there was tension swirling like undertow in a fast-moving current. Karen had escalated. After our last encounter, she hadn't retreated. Instead, she started a campaign, a full-blown HOA-sponsored information initiative. She sent out flyers, plastered bulletin boards, uploaded videos to the HOA website, warning of unlicensed private development and unauthorized water modifications threatening community ecosystems. She even filmed a video of herself standing at the fence line wearing her ridiculous vest and badge, reading from a clipboard like she was delivering a FEMA press conference. And the worst part, some people started believing her. Fear is sticky like that. It spreads. I got sideways looks from folks I'd known for years. Some crossed the street rather than wave. A few parents pulled their kids a little closer when I passed. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. Jordan warned me to stay the course. You've got the law, the deed, the upstream water rights. She's bluffing, he said. Let her bluff. But this wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about reputation and truth. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I stood up in public and told my story. The HOA's annual community forum was scheduled for the last Saturday of October. It wasn't a flashy event, more of a formality usually held in the high school gymnasium with coffee, awkward donuts, and a PowerPoint that made everyone wish they'd stayed home. But that year, it was standing room only. I'd posted one simple notice on the HOA's community board 2 days before. Presentation by Jack Lawson, The Truth About the Creek. Property rights, water law. What your dues are really paying for. It spread like wildfire. When I arrived, people were already gathered in clumps, whispering, side-eyeing Karen, who stood stiffly near the front row, surrounded by her loyal few. I walked to the podium with a USB stick in my pocket and a stack of documents under my arm. No theatrics, just truth. The president of the HOA, a thin, tired-looking man named Brent, who clearly hated confrontation, tried to breeze past my segment, calling it an optional update from a concerned resident. But the murmurs in the room wouldn't let him. People wanted answers, so he relented, and I stepped forward. Thank you for giving me a few minutes, I began. I know the past few months have been confusing. There's been a lot of talk, some of it angry, some of it frightening. But I'd like to offer something different tonight, something provable. I plugged in the USB. The projector lit up the screen behind me. Slide 1, a map of the neighborhood. Slide 2, the creek, with red outlines showing my original parcel and the 5 upstream lots I now owned. Slide 3, the stamped deed from the county recorder's office. Slide 4, a scanned copy of my water stewardship declaration filed and logged. Slide 5, a photo of Karen's fence bisecting my land with a caption that read, "No permit, no notice, no jurisdiction." I walked through each document slowly. I showed the timeline of events: when the fence was built, when Karen's fake citations were issued, when she trespassed, when the survey stakes were ripped from the ground. I presented the hydrology reports showing how our creek's health had improved since the restoration work began. Then I showed the final slide. HOA budget line item. Creekside Nature Corridor Development. $26,800 spent from general dues. Environmental impact study not filed. Permit none located. Public vote not recorded. A gasp spread through the room. Then silence. I turned back to face the audience. I'm not here to divide this neighborhood, I said. But I am here to defend it, because this place, this land, this water, doesn't belong to a handful of people with clipboards and laminated badges. It belongs to all of us. And if we allow lies, intimidation, and fake authority to rule, then none of us are truly safe in our own backyards. No one said a word. Karen was frozen in her chair. Her face looked pale, her jaw locked. I could tell she wanted to speak, to jump up, to discredit me. But there was nothing left to stand on. And then came the questions. Not for me, for her. What permits do you have, Karen? Why didn't we vote on this? Where's the environmental study? Why are you spending our dues without oversight? Her answers were thin, defensive, evasive. And by the time the forum adjourned, she wasn't surrounded by loyalists anymore. She stood alone, gathering her binder, her badge slipping sideways on its lanyard. She didn't look at me as she walked out, but I looked at everyone else. I saw heads nodding. I saw a few people shaking my hand. I saw eyes that used to look past me now looking toward me. That night, I walked the length of the creek with a lantern in hand. The air was cool, the water quiet, and for the first time in months, it felt like my home again. The fence was still there, but its power was gone. And in its place, something better had started to grow. Truth, respect, and the first seeds of change. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with silence. No more flyers, no more patrols. The daily walk-bys from Karen's so-called compliance team evaporated. Her golf cart disappeared from its usual spot behind the clubhouse. The security cameras that once blinked at me from the fence line stopped blinking altogether. At first, I thought she was regrouping, planning her next move. But then, I started hearing the whispers. Apparently, after the forum, a small group of neighbors had requested an emergency audit of the HOA's finances. That in itself wasn't revolutionary. People had grumbled about dues for years, but this time, they had momentum and receipts. With Jordan's help, I passed along a few more documents, meeting minutes screenshots, invoices tied to the Creekside Nature Corridor project. I didn't push it. I didn't need to. The HOA board was imploding under its own weight. And Karen, she wasn't answering questions. I ran into Brent, the HOA president, at the post office one afternoon. He looked exhausted. I told her he muttered stuffing envelopes into a P.O. box. I told her to slow down, to go through the right channels, but she said it had to be fast, visible. Said we'd lose the community if we waited for votes and permits. He glanced around, then leaned closer. She forged one of the expense authorizations, he whispered. Signed my name on a landscaping contract I'd never seen. I blinked. Is that criminal? He gave a bitter laugh. It is now. We brought in outside counsel. She's being investigated. That was it. The great HOA enforcer, the badge-wearing self-appointed sheriff of suburban order, was under formal review for misappropriation of funds and falsification of documents. Word spread fast. Within a week, her name was scrubbed from the HOA website. By the end of the month, her mailbox was gone, and a small for sale by owner sign appeared in her front yard. She never came to another meeting, never said goodbye. One day, she was there patrolling the fence line like a queen in exile, and the next, her house sat dark blinds pulled tight, driveway empty. Some people celebrated. Others just moved on. But me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. And more than anything, I felt responsible for what came next. With Karen gone and the board temporarily restructured, Brent approached me about helping revise the HOA's environmental policy. He wanted input, clarity, transparency. I'm not looking to run anything, I said, but I'll help make sure no one ever tries something like that again. So I did. We drafted new rules. A no project over 5,000 without a community vote. All land use near private property lines requires dual notification. And most importantly, a clause reaffirming that HOA jurisdiction ends at the edge of each homeowner's deed period. I offered to host an open Q&A about riparian rights and water law. Nearly 40 people showed up, more than any meeting Karen had ever run. We didn't just repair the creek. We repaired the community. The fence eventually came down. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Volunteers helped carry off sections like symbolic bricks from a fallen wall. The cameras were dismantled, the signs removed, and one crisp December morning, I walked to the edge of my yard and saw a boy, maybe 6 or 7, tossing rocks into the water, laughing as the splashes chased each other downstream. His mother stood nearby, smiling nervously, until she saw me watching. He's not bothering anything, is he? She asked. I shook my head. Not at all. This creek is meant to be enjoyed. She smiled back. Sometimes healing doesn't look like victory. It looks like trust returning slow and unsure. It looks like neighbors becoming neighbors again. One day, Derek stopped me while I was pruning back some blackberry bushes. "Hey," he said, "you ever think about running for the board?" I laughed. "I've had enough HOA drama for one lifetime." He shrugged. "Still, people trust you now. That matters." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. Later that week, I walked the entire length of the creek from my property, through the restored bend all the way up to the headwaters. The air was clean. The water was moving fast, steady. And when I reached the edge of the final parcel I now owned, I sat on a fallen log and listened. It was quiet, peaceful, but not empty. It was the sound of balance returning. The water didn't judge. It didn't choose sides. It just flowed. Like truth. Like justice. Like the things we forget are ours until someone tries to take them. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was defending my home anymore. I felt like I'd reclaimed it. The first snow came early that year. It dusted the ridge above the headwaters like powdered sugar, softening the edges of a landscape that had been a battlefield just weeks before. I stood at the top of my upstream parcel, hands in my coat pockets, watching as the flakes danced over the surface of the creek. The water was darker in winter, quieter somehow, but still sure of itself. Still moving. Downstream, the neighborhood was finally settling into something that resembled peace. Karen's house sold before the new year. I didn't attend the open house, but I saw the real estate agent out front, cheerfully pointing at the wraparound porch and speaking in that overly polished voice agents always use to pretend history doesn't hang in the air like smoke. A young couple moved in a few weeks later. Teachers, I heard. No clipboard. No HOA fantasies. Just people looking for quiet. The new HOA board sent out a holiday letter in early December, this time co-signed by 3 different members. None of them named Karen. It was short, simple, and most importantly, honest. As we reflect on this past year, we recognize both the challenges we've faced and the resilience our community has shown. We're committed to transparency, fairness, and rebuilding trust. Thank you for your patience. It was the first HOA message I'd read in years that didn't make my jaw tighten. I never became a board member. Despite the suggestions, I stayed where I belonged, a steward of the land, a neighbor among neighbors. But I did take on something new. I started teaching small workshops at the community center once a month, no fanfare on property rights, land stewardship, and how to navigate HOA regulations without losing your mind or your home. The first class had 5 people. By spring, we had to move it to the larger room. People came with questions, frustrations, notebooks full of fines and warnings, photos of hedges an inch too high, paint chips that weren't board approved. I didn't have all the answers, but I had experience, and now I had credibility. Not because I shouted the loudest, but because I stood calmly, relentlessly when it mattered most. Ellie, my daughter, came home from school for spring break. She was taller now, more confident, with her mother's quiet fire in her eyes. She asked to walk the creek with me the day she got back. We followed it from the backyard, tracing the newly cleared path through the trees. The restoration work had taken hold, grasses growing where erosion once gnawed stones placed just right to guide the flow. She reached down, cupped her hand in the water, and smiled. "Still cold," she said. "Always will be," I replied. We sat near the old oak tree, the one I'd planted the year her mother passed, and watched the water. "You really bought the whole watershed?" she asked, teasing me. "Not the whole thing," I smiled. "Just the parts that mattered." She laughed, then leaned her head on my shoulder. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just the sound of the creek and the wind rustling through the cedars above. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. And something in me broke, not from pain, but from the pressure of holding it all in for so long. The fight, the exhaustion, the nights I questioned if it was worth it. To hear those words from the person who'd floated leaf boats in this water as a child, it was everything. "You protected something real," she added. I nodded, throat too tight to answer. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed in quiet ways. People planted wildflowers along the water's edge. Someone built a small bench out of reclaimed wood and set it near the bend. Kids started walking the trail again, no longer under the gaze of cameras or fences. And every once in a while, someone new would knock on my door, usually with questions, sometimes with coffee, and ask, "How did you do it? How did you win?" I always told them the same thing. I didn't win. I held on. That was the difference. Because that's what Karen never understood. This place wasn't just real estate. It was roots. It was memory. It was the pulse of something that couldn't be fenced or signed away. Power doesn't come from clipboards or laminated vests. It comes from knowing what's yours and having the courage to stand in front of it when the storm hits, even if you're standing alone, especially then. The fence is gone now. The signs are gone, but the creek remains constant, free, winding through my land like a quiet promise that some things can't be taken if you know how to hold on. And every morning I walk beside it, not as a guard, not as a rebel, just as a man who fought for his home and found something deeper running through it.